A large bank is predicting that in 20 years, space tourism will be a fast-growing market of $3 billion. At the end of 2019, Virgin Galactic, founded by Richard Branson, went public with the promise to become the world leader.
Hold on. World leader of what? Space tourism, of course.
Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, is investing aggressively in Blue Origin, a space program that, among other things, is also targeting space tourism. So, given all this action, what should we think about this new market? Should you bet your own money on space tourism? In 2001, Dennis Tito spent $20 million of his personal fortune to stay a few days on the International Space Station, making him the first space tourist in history.
Wow.
Since then, there has been all kinds of speculation on space tourism. Yet, 20 years later, takeoff is still waiting. Since Tito, there has been only, 7 space tourists, the last one in 2009. So, is space tourism not such a good idea after all?
Is it? Not so fast.
In recent years, a new generation of companies led by billionaires with deep pockets are investing heavily in the subject. The subject is quite dense, and we have a lot of points to cover, so make yourself comfortable and feel free to have a cup of coffee.
I'll have a latte.
Space tourism can be divided into broadly 2 distinct categories. Number 1, orbital flights, and number 2, suborbital flights. As its name suggests, orbital flights is about orbiting around Earth, usually for a few days. To go to a place like the International Space Station, you need to rise 400 kilometers above sea level and get to the amazing speed of almost 28,000 kilometers per hour. Suborbital flight is much less ambitious. It simply allows you to briefly leave the Earth's atmosphere during a short ballistic flight. To reach space, you need to go beyond the so-called Kármán line, located at an altitude of 100 kilometers. The part of the flight in space only lasts a few minutes. The speed required for suborbital flight is 8 times lower than what is necessary to go into orbit. As we will see, this big gap in speed has a huge impact on the price of the ticket.
So here we are. How much does it cost?
In 2019, NASA began marketing the International Space Station as a space hotel for $35,000 a night, roughly the price of a junior suite in a grand palace. As maintenance costs of the space station is around $4 billion per year, and the station has a capacity of, 6 guests only, a quick calculation shows that the overnight stay in space should be priced at least $2 million. With this huge discount, NASA made the headlines. If you can afford it, $35,000 per night looks quite reasonable to enjoy such a unique view of Earth.
What a view!
What NASA did not insist on, however, is that this price does not include transportation. Sending a human into orbit still costs at least $20 million. At that price, even if the night on the ISS was free, it would still be a totally different game. In comparison, Virgin Galactic suborbital flight experience is 100 times cheaper. Okay, it's still a $200,000 ticket. In any case, we can see that space tourism will remain for a long time a pleasure for the rich. And I mean the very, very rich.
Like really rich.
To find out if space tourism has a future, we will now try to estimate its TAM, or total addressable market.
TAM.
The TAM is a very useful concept because it represents the theoretical maximum revenue a company can expect if it captures 100% of the market. Calculating a TAM is always a bit of a tricky exercise. It's even more difficult for a market like space tourism that doesn't really exist yet. To make it simple, we can use 2 methods. First one, top-down. Second one, bottom-up. The top-down approach is the one used by most bankers and consultants. It has the big advantage to get quickly to a result, which seems to make sense.
Top down.
This approach works in 3 steps. First step, we define a target price for the product we want to sell. Second step, we estimate the number of customers who can afford the product at that price. And finally, the third step, we estimate the adoption rate, namely, how many of these potential customers will actually buy the product.
I think I got it.
So let's apply the top-down method to our suborbital and orbital options. In our case, the first step is easy. As we've seen, suborbital flights is priced at $200,000 and the orbital at $20 million. Let's now look at the number of potential customers who can afford this kind of treat. In its IPO document, Virgin Galactic claims that for an extraordinary experience, people can spend around 1% of their wealth. So think about what 1% of your wealth represents and ask yourself if you would burn it on something a little crazy.
Like really crazy.
If we take Virgin's assumption, it means that suborbital flights are today aiming at the ultra-rich who have in their bank account 100 times the price of the ticket, so at least $20 million. This very select club represents around 350,000 people worldwide. As for the real orbital trip, we are talking here of people who are 100 times richer than that. It's a group 1,000 times smaller, with only 350 people in the world.
I wanna be a billionaire so fucking bad.
For the last step of the top-down approach, we have to estimate how many people in each group would be ready for the ride. To do this, we rely on surveys on prospects who are asked a question like, would you be willing to spend 1% of your wealth to look at the Earth from space?
I think I would do that.
As space has remained very glamorous, around 30% of people do answer yes to this type of question. The problem is that in real life, there's always a big gap between what you answer in a survey and what you really do when asked to open your wallet. Typically, you have to take a 50% error margin. This means that in our case, there are in fact only 15% of respondents who would be really ready to spend the cash for a space trip. Then, as we want to calculate an annual market, we must estimate how often clients will buy this type of service. Buying a second ticket supposes you made your space trip not only to realize a childhood dream, or to impress your bored rich friends, but because you truly enjoyed it. Speaking of which, it is relevant that among the 7 tourists who paid to visit the space station in the 2000s, only 1 renewed the experience. This means a 14% renewal rate over 10 years.
Not super impressive.
For our future market, let's be more optimistic and assume that clients will repeat the experience on average once every 5 years. When we combine these factors, this gives around 10,000 serious prospects for suborbital flights each year and only 11 prospects for orbital flight.
Whoops.
This gives an addressable future market of $2 billion for suborbital flights and only $210 million for orbital flights. Remember, this is the theoretical maximum addressable market, not the expected revenue of a space tourism company, which can only be a fraction of that. What can we learn from these figures? We see first that the TOM for orbital flight is tiny. A market with at best 11 potential customers per year is almost impossible to manage. For suborbital flights, it's a different story. 10,000 customers per year for $2 billion? This is a really nice addressable market for a startup. Even if Virgin Galactic can only capture a fraction of that, it's no surprise that the Richard Branson's IPO was warmly welcomed by investors. Especially since it is only a TAM at constant prices. What Virgin Galactic is hoping for is that by ramping up flights, the cost per flight should drop dramatically. If Virgin manages to cut in half the price of its tickets, it will be able to target 3 times more potential customers, and its addressable market will increase by 50%. It is the promise of seeing this market expanding in the future that made Virgin Galactic investors bullish on the stock. The main issue with the top-down approach is that it relies on surveys with no real commitment from prospects. The 50% cut we took is only a very rough estimate. Before it even started operating, Virgin Galactic claimed to have already registered 600 confirmed orders for a suborbital flight. 600 is a good start, especially at this super premium price tag. But at the same time, it only represents 6% of potential prospects. Well, 6% adoption is typically what you would expect from early adopters. You know, Those guys who always want to experience things before everyone else. If the remaining 94% of the group happen to be much more difficult to convince than the pioneers, the real TAM may turn out to be much smaller than initially predicted. To give us some more comfort on the true potential of space tourism, let's check the bottom-up approach.
Bottom up, bottom up, bottom up.
The idea here is to start from what clients already spend today on things relatively similar and then extrapolate for our case. Of course, no product is exactly the same, which makes extrapolation a bit tricky. But the bottom-up approach has the huge advantage to be based on real expenses and real trade-offs, rather than surveys that commit nothing. Let's start with suborbital flights. In its business plan, Virgin Galactic argues that some super wealthy spend more than $200,000 to rent a luxury yacht for a week. But is this really an apple-to-apple comparison? On one side, you have a flight to the edge of space, which is certainly spectacular, but lasts only minutes. On the other side, you get a whole week of leisure and luxury. So, what is Virgin Galactic exactly selling? Suborbital flights essentially offer two promises. One, the promise of enjoying a unique view where as you enter space, the sky goes from blue to black. At the altitude of 100 kilometers, you're not high enough to see the whole Earth, but you can already see very well its curvature. By the way, a must-do trip for any flat Earth devotees. 2. The second promise is to experience microgravity for a few minutes. Floating in space like a real astronaut? Wow! When it comes to the view, the Russian company MiG-Flug says $15,000 packages which allow you to climb up in a MiG-29 at an altitude of 20 kilometers. Admittedly, it is not as high as Virgin Galactic, but it's a good start. At those 20 kilometers above the ground, you already distinguish the curvature of the Earth and the blackness of space. As a bonus, the pilot takes you on all kinds of spectacular loops, which, by the way, are unthinkable in the Virgin package. Remember, this is 12 times cheaper than Virgin Galactic's suborbital experience. At that price, the market able to afford this adrenaline rush is around 360,000 people. In theory, this should be big enough to keep dozens of MiG-29s flying tourists all day long. Unfortunately, demand was so limited that the company ended this offer. It seems that most clients prefer to pay $5,000 to experience the thrills of flying on a fighter plane, but not the additional $10,000 to see the curvature of the Earth and the dark blue sky. Given that, it looks like a hard sell to convince people to pay 10 times more just to see the Earth from a little higher. But what about that second promise, the weightlessness experience? If you want to live this incredible experience, it's actually very simple. In the US, Zero-G markets parabolic flights on a Boeing 727. For $5,000, you will get 15 parabolic arcs, which creates a weightlessness environment allowing you to float for 20 to 30 seconds.
So much fun!
Up to 34 paying passengers can board each flight. Zero-G is offering 100 flights per year. There are similar parabolic flights in Europe and in Russia, but with less customer traction than in the US. Overall, the world market for weightlessness experience is probably less than 10,000 tourists per year. With a $5,000 price tag, there should be around 120 million people worldwide who could afford this experience. 10,000 passengers for 120 million prospects? This means that each year we get a conversion rate less than 0.01%. One of the key reasons that prevents more traction is that approximately half of the participants experience nausea while floating. Probably the reason why Zero-G plane is referred as the vomit comet. And even if you don't get sick yourself, having your neighbor who regurgitates his bowels is enough to spoil the party. Now, thanks to Virgin Galactic's exceptional marketing skills, let's assume we get a conversion rate for suborbital flights 10 times better than for the vomit comet. If we apply this to the people who can afford a $200,000 flight, this allows to sell 350 tickets per year. This means that with its 600 pre-orders over the past 5 years, Virgin Galactic has already almost booked 2 years of business in a suborbital market, which ultimately weighs only a paltry $70 million per year. Even if we assume that Virgin Galactic will be able to capture 100% of this market, this makes the $500 million revenue forecast in 3 years quite challenging.
Tough one.
The only way for Virgin Galactic to make it is to be able to offer a drastic cut in the ticket price. For example, at $10,000 per seat, they could sell around 30,000 tickets per year and expand the market to $300 million. Hopefully, this might be enough to get in the black. And of course, this drastic price cut must be achieved without compromising on safety. No need to insist that if there were any serious accidents during commercial operation, it would pretty much just kill the whole thing. Last but not least, assuming the market accelerates to thousands of suborbital flights per year, it's quite likely that it will raise growing environmental concerns. This could quickly make this activity perceived as uncool.
Uncool.
As a matter of fact, some historic shareholders of Virgin Galactic seem to have second thoughts. From the IPO document, we learned that out of the $700 million raised during the IPO, $300 million went not into the coffers of the company, but directly into the pockets of the previous shareholders. This secondary offer is quite unusual for an IPO in the United States and could raise an alarm bell among savvy investors. Now, let's apply the bottom-up approach to orbital flights. With a $20 million ticket, we have seen that the market is so tiny that it just doesn't make sense. To make an interesting forecast, we have to imagine a future, hopefully not too far away, where the cost to go into orbit will have dropped dramatically. For instance, let's take the ambitious assumption that the price of a trip in orbit around the Earth is down to $40,000 per person. This means a price cut by a factor of 500. Needless to say, there is little chance to see this happening in our lifetime. However, it's worth looking where this could take us. Beyond its cost, an orbital trip has a few characteristics that make it very special. Number 1, it requires a very good physical condition. Speaking of that, let's remember the story of Daisuke Inamote. In 2006, this rich Japanese made a $21 million advance payment to stay a few days on the International Space Station.
That's a lot of money.
However, 3 weeks before launch, final medical tests found him unfit for the mission. Unfortunately for him, his contract with the company Space Adventures did not include any reimbursement. No matter how hard he battled in the courtroom, he never got his money back. Number 2, it requires a long training. Even as a plain-paying tourist, to have the privilege of going into space, you have to go through several months of intensive training in a specialized center. The safety procedures are so complex that, in comparison, aviation is like a child's game. Number 3, it is a dangerous activity. 5% of astronauts who have gone to space have died during training or mission. After 60 years, more than 2% of rocket launch still experience a serious incident during takeoff or ascent. We can certainly improve this ratio in the future, but it remains that getting on a rocket is like sitting on top of 1,000 tons of TNT and convincing yourself that there will be no glitch during the firing. As for space itself, this will always remain a super hostile environment where the slightest error can be fatal. At last, returning on Earth is also a very delicate time, and the slightest issue quickly turns into a drama. Number 4, and this last point is particularly important to keep in mind in the context of tourism, orbital flight is an activity that requires to accept a significant degree of physical discomfort. The first thing that strikes everyone entering the International Space Station is the constant noise of the vent machines. There is also a strong smell, a mix of antiseptic and sweat, quite similar to what you find in a prison. Nothing so surprising in such a confined space. In weightlessness, the most basic needs like going to the bathroom quickly become a frustrating experience. In such a constrained habitat, one has to give up all intimacy. On top of this, during the first 3 days in space, most people experience a more or less violent but inevitable space sickness.
Space sickness. Oh, it sounds like so much fun.
The reward is, of course, to enjoy a magnificent view that very few humans have had the privilege to experience. Often, you will hear futurists trying to portray your vacation in orbit as glamorous as staying in a luxury Caribbean resort. But given what we just said, the experience that seems to me the closest is the ascent of Mount Everest. At first glance, this analogy may seem a bit far-fetched, but when you look closely, the similarities are quite striking. For a long time, climbing Mount Everest was a feat reserved for the best professional mountaineers. In recent years, with a budget of $50,000, it is now a dream within the reach of any ambitious tourist. As with spaceflight, you need, of course, very good physical condition. It is also an experience that requires a significant time investment. You need at least several weeks to adapt to high altitudes before starting the ascent of the summit. Despite the steady improvement in mountain gear, it also remains a dangerous activity with a mortality rate of around 3%. Finally, even in its most luxurious version, physical comfort remains very limited. In the end, a fairly similar reward with orbital flight, a spectacular view, and not much else to do. Oh, and you get the pleasure of entering into a very small club and enjoy the well-deserved admiration of people around you. Mount Everest has become very trendy over the years. In 2019, Nepal and China sold a record of 600 permits. It is enough to create a traffic jam near the top, but not enough to make it a big market. Assuming that one day we will see orbital packages priced at $50,000, it would already be a great achievement to convince 1,000 or 2,000 people per year. In any case, we are talking about an orbital tourism market of less than $100 million. We can always try to convince ourselves that the real future of space tourism will be a trek on the moon. Walking around the Sea of Tranquility sounds more exciting than just being locked in a tin can making selfies around the Earth. But compared to Orbital, the price of a lunar trip is on a whole different league. The first offer from Space Adventure starts at $100 million. At this price, which already seems crazy for most people, you can just fly over to the moon, not even to land on it. Of course, you would get all the other constraints described above: danger, discomfort, and other thrills of space. In short, it is clearly not a consumer product for a very, very long time. When we look at the numbers, we have to realize that space tourism, whether suborbital or orbital, will remain a small game for a few super wealthy space geeks. The transition to a large-scale tourism market is not for tomorrow, not even for our children. Well aware of the challenge, the billionaires funding those projects claim that the real opportunity for their rockets is to offer super-fast intercontinental flights. With a ballistic rocket, SpaceX claims that they can connect any point on Earth in less than an hour. New York, Tokyo, or Boston, Sydney in 60 minutes is surely very appealing. Rather than suborbital flights being the bungee jumping of the super rich, it could go after a real market of business customers for whom time is money. This is more the transportation than tourism industry. Xenon Research will make a video devoted to this fascinating topic. In the meantime, feel free to like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you!